You wouldn't be accused of being wrong if you said SUVs have taken over the planet. Any street you're on, look around, you'll see them absolutely everywhere. But it wasn't always like this. Many of us were reared in a humble hatchback car. And in 2025, heading into 2026, it feels like the hatchback really is starting to disappear. And I'm just wondering, is that a good thing? Back in 1974, a new hatchback was unveiled to the world. Volkswagen sold almost 40 million of these cars. Back as recently as 2015, they were still making over 1 million Golfs a year for global production. However, in 2025, they estimate they'll build about 250,000 Golfs. So, why the demise? The answer to that question is sort of threefold. You've got SUVs, of course. VW have their own arsenal of them. The T-Cross, the T-Roc, the Tayron, the Tiguan, the Touareg, although that's in a slightly different category, and they've also announced that they're killing it. Then you've got electrification. So the ID.3 was, for a while, seemed to be the progressor of this car. And then you've got price. Cars have gotten very, very expensive. While the entry version Golf will now cost you mid-30s, including delivery, and I do feel 1,800 delivery charges a little bit extreme, it's not all as it was. Yes, you can still just about get a manual Golf, but most of them are now automatic. Most of them come with a whole suite of safety kit as standard, cameras, heated seats, not blind spot for some strange reason, nicer alloy wheels. I grew up in a time and was transported in a Mark I Golf for the early stage of my life, and that had keep fit windows and barely a car radio. So the Golf as you perhaps remember it may not be as scabby when it comes to standard kit these days. I've asked people over the years why they like SUVs so much. Some talk about the ride height, they feel safer inside them, they feel like they're bigger, and they feel like they have bigger boots. In some cases, that's kind of true, but there's plenty of SUVs in the market that barely scrape 400 litres. Now the Golf doesn't even do that. In fact, it has 381 litres in the Mark 8.5. There's a bit of storage down below, but I am left wondering how I'd repair a puncture at the side of the Dublin Mountains this morning if I got one. So yes, they are definitely smaller, and if you have a growing family, I appreciate you're not really going to get a fancy buggy system into the back of that thing. At least if you do, there won't be room for anything else. But not everybody has babies. In the same vein, in the rear of your average hatchback space, well, it's okay, but again, it just depends on your needs. If you do have rear-facing child seats, it's going to be a bit tight. Again, some vehicles, but not all, do have a bit more rear legroom. And you could look at the back of this car and go, where's my climate control, my digital climate control, in an R-Line version at least, because it costs the guts of €45,000 if you want an automatic gearbox. Not cheap, granted. It is hard to get away from that famous Golf thud when you close the door of one. That's even in the rear doors, which a lot of brands sometimes make the heavier doors on the front of the car to give you that solid feeling. On the R-Line vein, actually, I'd be a little bit miffed if I had a Golf or an actual Golf or, because I drove past one this morning, similar colour, 2 years older, and apart from the quad exhaust in the back, it's not very different to this much lesser R-Line trim version that isn't a Golf R. And whether it is that 4Motion 2-litre beast that reminds us of the extremely capable cars VW can make, or indeed the iconic Golf GTI, I can't help wondering why we've fallen out of love with particularly the Golf and also the hatchback. 17% is an interesting number when it comes to electric cars. It's pretty much where the sales of them are in Ireland, and pretty much where the sales of them are in Europe in 2025. In fact, plug-in hybrids, PHEVs, which generally have a petrol, not diesel engine, are actually growing in popularity also across the continent. I was at the recent IAA mobility show in Munich, and all the heads and stakeholders of all the big brands were there, including VW had one of the best stage shows of the whole event. And one theme was common, whether it was the head of BMW, Porsche, Audi, you name it. They all said they're going to have to shed jobs, they're going to have to save money if Europe continues with this mantra of no internal combustion engines from, in some days it's 2030, in other months it's 2035. There's too much uncertainty. And while it's absolutely certain electrification is part of the future, it's a growing fuel source in Ireland. In fact, a couple of months ago, it actually overtook diesel. I just think there's been so much distraction with it, we've kind of forgotten about how good a petrol, hatchback, non-SUV, non-electric car can be. And this is a mild hybrid, so it'll still do about 6.5 litres per 100 kilometres. Maybe not quite as good as a similar diesel, which might get 5 litres per 100 kilometres. And I can't help wondering as I look around this refreshed version of the Golf, if the answer is actually right under our nose. The other difficult challenge ahead is China. It is incomprehensible how quickly they can do things. Remember at the very start of COVID, how quickly they were able to build a hospital just outside Wuhan. Despite those staggering figures, China only has a car park of around 20 million cars a year. And a lot of those excess cars are going to have to go to Europe. Many of you will say the European manufacturers like VW had it too good for too long and serves them right. And that is one way you can look at the whole thing. The other is Europe and car manufacturing jobs. They kind of go hand in hand. It's a big industry and there's constant reacting now happening to sales. You have Ford, who just have a brand new plant for electrification, and they'd barely opened it and they were talking about more job cuts. They killed the Fiesta. In fact, they teamed up with VW for their Explorer and their Capri, which really doesn't seem to have gone down particularly well. I think in the short term, EU is kind of limited in what it can do. Yes, you can apply additional tariffs to Chinese cars, but the Chinese companies will just get around that. They're building factories in Europe. They're going to produce cars in Europe. There's no doubt they're getting state support to help produce these vehicles. When you look at what they go for sale in China, it's a fraction of what they can sell the cars for in Europe. So they're still undoubtedly quids in. And in your opinion, what is the way forward in the future for cars like the Golf that just want to run on a mild hybrid 1.5 petrol engine? Even at home, we are giving state support to every new EV that is currently on sale. And I do wonder if that €3,500 or so €1,000 grant was gone, would petrol cars like the Golf come back into fashion? Sit into a Golf or any hatchback for that matter, and the seating position is so much lower. And if you like cars, that is just a better way to be in control of a vehicle. You can still get a manual gearbox if you like, something that we are seeing declining all the time. I had a Mark IV Golf GTI over 20 years ago. The dashboard was incredibly squishy, and that kind of has made its way back into the Mark 8.5. Everything around you in this car feels well put together, solid. These Orline seats are very, very comfortable. They hug you into place. And there's just something very nice about that old familiar feeling. It's like going home to your mammy when you're sick home from school and getting tucked into the couch with a blankie. You could also argue VW didn't help themselves over the last few years with the lack of illuminated sliders and haptic buttons. In the 8.5, they have seen sense. They say that will never happen again, and they brought it all back. I'm sure some of you watching today are hoping that there's enough changes in this 8.5 version of the Golf to justify trading up. And I posted this car on Instagram a couple of days ago, and I was kind of shocked and surprised to see the reaction and the love. And I think it's the threat of cars like this disappearing forever that maybe is making people realise, oh, hang on a second, hang on, I didn't say get rid of it. When I drove Golfs in the noughties, even though they were GTIs, I'd always have friends and colleagues who'd say, oh, the Golf's so boring, you know, oh, you're so predictable. But when we look back now on the test of time, and people are just so into their GTIs and Golf Wars, maybe I was actually ahead of my time. And the point remains, I mean, this has 150 brake horsepower. My Mark IV GTI had 150 brake horsepower. I adjusted for inflation, and again, it was 20 years ago. I bought a Mark V brand new GTI, not a single, 18-inch alloys. That was the only extra on it. And that car was €35,000. Allowing for inflation, that's about just shy of 50,000. But that said, sometimes it's just very, very difficult to use the power. And this quick DSG gearbox made it to 150 brake horsepower, 1.5 petrol ETSI, kind of does the job. The steering has a lovely weighted feel to it. And compared to driving in so many SUVs so often, it's remarkable the lack of body roll. And I also remember those days in the early noughties when, you know, I was lucky to be able to, I was working a lot and I was young and still living at home. So car budgets weren't really the top of your mind. You know, you didn't want to spend too much, but, you know, you knew what you liked and you were like, well, look, I'll worry about, you know, responsibilities someday down the road. And even a 1.6 Highline was a highly, highly desirable car. That was the aspirational car growing up. I was like, oh, I'd love a Golf. Love a Golf. They held their values well. Yeah, they could be accused of being a little bit samey, a little bit boring, but there was something desirable about them. And maybe we've lost that, you know, just natural things happen. People want a fancier toy or whatever. You know, I understand that. But there comes a time in your life where you kind of miss things that you took for granted. Whether it was learning to play a musical instrument, that first car you had that you'd love back. The interiors are very, very nice, and they still do, as I mentioned earlier on, have some lovely, soft, squishy materials that you just don't get in a lot of electric cars because the price is trying to be squeezed into a budget to include a battery. And certainly with the ID3, they just don't have an interior as good as a Golf. That's a fact. And as I mentioned, also, yes, it's petrol, but this is doing about 6.7 litres per 100 kilometres. It's a little bit noisy on the wrong road surface sometimes, perhaps, but it's well dampened, even though it has these large enough alloy wheels. It's comfortable. It's the handling stakes that are just impressive for what it is. There's no body roll. For that reason alone, if you do want to save even more fuel, but it's going to cost you a bit more on the initial purchase price, there is a plug-in hybrid Golf. Will we see a full-on electric version of one? I think that would be silly if that doesn't happen. And I'm also thinking of my kids. They're a little bit young now for driving, but when we don't need a bigger space boot, is this a car the whole family could share and insure cheaply, not get into masses of trouble with because it's not too fast? But is it going to keep them safe when they're driving late at night? It's a car that kind of does all those things. Above all else, if you still like driving and how high you sit in your car is not the biggest priority for you, there's still life in the old Golf just yet. Where do we go from here then? This little video on my humble little YouTube channel isn't going to be enough to convince people to buy more hatchbacks. But if you're sitting on the fence, or maybe you're someone who has gone down the SUV route, you don't need that perceived more safer feeling car with a bigger boot anymore, and you want to remind yourself that things can actually be enjoyable to drive even in 2025, but they, in some cases, must have a petrol engine, must have some decent wheels, and must be good to drive. And you need a hatchback for that. Unless you've got buckets of money to buy something more exotic, which, let's face it, when a Golf of this spec at least costs mid-40s, you don't have. So we have a few choices here. We keep buying SUVs in their droves. Car companies will keep designing them because they want to sell cars to customers. Or something like this will fall by the wayside and the sales of the Golf will keep on declining till VW have to say, what do we do with it anymore? Or they can make it fully electric. The last e-Golf was a relative success. I don't know why they just didn't put a battery into a Golf and keep going. Will we see the ID3 around forever? That's the other question. Because for me, and possibly for you if you're a car head, there's a lot of heritage in this vehicle that something like an ID3 just doesn't have. I do think, however, this is going to be a case of we'll miss it when it's gone. And if sales of hatchbacks in general, not just the Golf, keep declining, those days might be here a lot closer than we think. Let me know your own thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you for coming with me on the video today. I hope you've enjoyed what is just a different take on something that I was curious about. Is the Golf still a relevant car in 2025 as we head into 2026? I personally think so. Sure, it has some space limitations, but it overcomes that in just being good to drive. You know, I've missed normal, regular cars that are just good to drive. And that's one of them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.